In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless species have evolved telepathic abilities as naturally as breathing, there exists one unbreakable rule that even the most arrogant civilizations dare not violate. Never attempt to read the mind of a human. The Zalathi Empire had conquered 17 star systems through the sheer power of mental domination. Their priests could break the will of entire populations with a single focused thought, turning proud warriors into willing slaves, and independent colonies into obedient vassals. For 3 centuries, no species had proven immune to their psychic intrusions. Then, they encountered Earth. What the Zalathi discovered in that first, fatal moment of contact would shatter their understanding of consciousness itself. For in the depths of a human mind lies something so alien, so impossibly complex, that even glimpsing it drives the most powerful telepaths to madness. High Priest Keth Moran was the strongest mind reader of his generation, capable of sifting through the thoughts of 1,000 beings simultaneously. He had never encountered a mental barrier he couldn't break, never found a consciousness he couldn't dominate. Until he tried to read the thoughts of Captain Sarah Chan, commander of the human exploration vessel, Defiance. What he found waiting for him in that seemingly ordinary human mind would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever, and leave him screaming truths that no telepathic species was ever meant to know. This is the story of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, when the predator becomes the prey, and when humanity's greatest strength is revealed to be the very thing that makes them appear weak to the rest of the universe. The Zalathi thought they were about to add another species to their empire. They had no idea they were about to discover why humans are the most terrifying species in the galaxy. The Zalathi warship Mind's Edge hung in space like a predatory beast, its crystalline hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that would have been beautiful to human eyes, had any human been close enough to see them and survive. The vessel stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its organic curves and flowing lines making it appear more grown than built. Along its surface, thousands of neural conduits glowed with psychic energy, channeling the collective mental power of the 300 Zalathi aboard. High Priest Keth Moran stood in the ship's meditation chamber, his tall, ethereal form draped in robes that seemed to shift between dimensions. His pale blue skin was marked with the intricate tattoos that denoted his rank, each line representing a conquered world, a broken species, a civilization brought to heel through the power of his mind. His large black eyes reflected no light, for he rarely bothered to use physical sight when his mental perception could show him so much more. The chamber itself was a marvel of Zalathi biotechnology, its walls lined with neural clusters that amplified telepathic abilities 1,000-fold. Here, surrounded by the living ship's psychic resonance, Keth Moran could reach across star systems to touch the minds of beings light-years away. He had used this very chamber to break the will of the Corvan resistance, to turn the Malethian war fleet against itself, and to reduce the proud synthetic collective to slavering automatons begging for the mercy of organic thought. Today would be no different. Another species would fall before the might of the Zalathi Empire. Report. Keth Moran spoke without moving his lips. His words carried directly into the minds of his subordinates through the ship's neural network. Navigator Yothnel, a younger priest whose tattoos were still sparse compared to his master's, approached with the reverence due to one of Keth Moran's station. "We have detected a vessel of unknown configuration, High Priest. It appears to be conducting survey operations in the outer system. The ship is small, perhaps 200 meters in length, and shows no signs of advanced weaponry." Keth Moran allowed himself a moment of amusement. How many times had he heard those same words? Every first contact followed the same pattern: discovery, evaluation, conquest. The size of the ship mattered little when the crew could be turned into willing servants with a thought. "Origin?" he inquired, already beginning to extend his consciousness toward the distant vessel. "Unknown, High Priest. The ship's configuration is unlike anything in our databases. The hull appears to be purely mechanical rather than biomechanical, suggesting a species that has not yet evolved beyond crude technology." Primitive, then. This would be even easier than expected. Organic species without telepathic abilities were particularly vulnerable to mental domination, their minds lacking even the most basic defenses against psychic intrusion. Keth Moran closed his physical eyes and let his consciousness expand through the ship's neural network. He felt the minds of his crew like distant stars, each one a point of light in the vast darkness of space. Beyond them, he sensed the cold emptiness between worlds, the background radiation of the universe, and the faint gravitational whispers of distant planets. There, at the edge of his perception, he felt them. Life signs aboard the alien vessel. Carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, possessed of complex neural structures. perfect subjects for mental control. He reached out with his mind, extending tendrils of telepathic energy across the void. The distance was considerable, but not beyond his capabilities. He had touched minds across entire star systems when the need arose. The alien ship was called the Defiance, though Keth Moran gleaned this information not from any external source, but from the surface thoughts of its crew. 15 beings aboard, all of the same species. They called themselves humans, a designation that meant nothing to the High Priest. In a few moments it would matter even less. He selected his first target carefully, the ship's commander, a female designated as Captain Sarah Chen. Her mind would contain the tactical information he needed, as well as the authority structure necessary to control the entire crew. Once he had broken her will, the others would follow easily. Keth Moran gathered his considerable psychic power and struck. The moment his consciousness touched the edge of Sarah Chen's mind, everything went wrong. Instead of the familiar sensation of slipping past mental barriers like a knife through silk, Keth Moran felt himself confronting something impossible. The human's mind wasn't simply defended. It was a maze of contradictions, a storm of competing thoughts and emotions that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. He pressed deeper, confident that his centuries of experience would overcome whatever primitive defenses this species might possess. What he found defied everything he understood about consciousness. The human's mind was chaos. Not the simple chaos of fear or confusion that he had encountered in other species, but something far more profound. Sarah Chen was simultaneously terrified and curious about the strange ship that had appeared in their system. She was calculating tactical options, while also wondering if she had remembered to feed her cat before leaving Earth. She was reviewing her training on first contact protocols while simultaneously composing a letter to her sister and remembering the taste of her grandmother's apple pie and considering the philosophical implications of humanity's place in the universe and planning her crew's duty rotations and... The thoughts came at him like a tidal wave, each one real and present and active simultaneously. Keth Moran tried to focus on a single thread of consciousness, to find the central self that he could dominate, but there was no central self. The human's mind was a democracy of competing thoughts, emotions, memories, and impulses, all coexisting in impossible harmony. He pressed harder, drawing upon reserves of power that should have been sufficient to break an entire city's worth of minds. The harder he pushed, the more complex the human's mental landscape became. Her thoughts began to spawn new thoughts, each one branching and subdividing, like some kind of psychic fractal. Now she was thinking about the alien ship, while also remembering every science fiction movie she had ever seen, while simultaneously analyzing the tactical situation, while wondering if her executive officer needed a haircut, while contemplating the nature of consciousness, while planning her next meal, while missing her home, while feeling excited about making first contact, while being terrified of the implications. While Keth Moran tried to withdraw, but found that he couldn't. The human's mind had somehow begun to pull at his consciousness, drawing him deeper into the maze of her thoughts. He felt his own carefully ordered mental structure beginning to fray at the edges as Sarah Chen's chaotic thought patterns infected his own consciousness. This wasn't supposed to be possible. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never encountered a mind he couldn't break, couldn't control, couldn't understand. Yet this primitive human was not only resisting his intrusion, but somehow turning his own power against him. He reached out desperately through the ship's neural network, seeking the stable minds of his subordinates to anchor his consciousness. But even that contact was tainted now. Through his connection to Sarah Chen's mind, he was beginning to perceive his crew the way a human would perceive them. Navigator Yothnel, whom he had always seen as a competent subordinate, was suddenly revealed as a complex being with hopes and fears and dreams beyond his service to the Empire. The young priest worried about living up to his father's expectations, missed the bioluminescent gardens of his homeworld, and secretly questioned whether the Zalathi way of conquest was truly just. These thoughts weren't Yothnel's. They were Keth Moran's own mind interpreting Yothnel through the lens of human perception. The human's way of thinking was infectious, spreading through his consciousness like some kind of psychic virus. Still trapped in Sarah Chen's mind, Keth Moran felt himself experiencing human memory for the first time. He was 8 years old, standing in a hospital room, watching machines keep his grandfather alive. He was 18, graduating from the Space Academy with dreams of exploring the stars. He was 30, too, accepting command of the Defiance with pride and terror warring in his heart. But these weren't his memories. They were Sarah Chen's. And somehow, experiencing them, as if they were his own, was fundamentally altering his understanding of existence itself. Humans didn't just think. They felt everything they thought. Every logical decision was weighted with emotion. Every rational calculation colored by personal history. It was madness. It was chaos. It was completely unsustainable. And yet it worked. Somehow, impossibly, the human mind functioned perfectly well in this state of constant contradiction and complexity. More than functioned, it thrived. Sarah Chen was making rapid, accurate assessments of the tactical situation while simultaneously processing emotional responses to first contact while maintaining awareness of her crew's psychological state while planning multiple contingency scenarios. Keth Moran tried once more to withdraw, pouring all his remaining strength into breaking free of the human's mental gravity. For a moment, he thought he had succeeded. The chaos of Sarah Chen's thoughts began to fade, replaced by the familiar order of his own consciousness. Then he felt the human's attention focus on him. Until this moment, Sarah Chen had been unaware of his presence in her mind. The telepathic intrusion had occurred below the threshold of her conscious awareness, processed as nothing more than a vague sense of unease. But humans, Keth Moran realized too late, were remarkably sensitive to the presence of consciousness other than their own. Sarah Chen turned her attention inward, and suddenly Keth Moran found himself face to face with something that no telepathic species had ever evolved to encounter. A mind that was consciously aware of being read. The human's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Instead of the fear or confusion he expected, Sarah Chen responded with curiosity, anger, and tactical analysis all at once. She began actively thinking at him, deliberately generating the chaotic thought patterns that had already nearly broken his sanity. But worse than that, she began to think about him. And when a human mind focused its full attention on something, Keth Moran discovered the results were beyond anything he had imagined possible. Sarah Chen examined his presence in her mind with the same systematic approach she would use to analyze any new phenomenon. She noted the texture of his thoughts, the rhythm of his mental processes, the underlying structure of his consciousness. And as she did so, she began to understand him in a way that no being had ever understood him before. Through human perception, Keth Moran saw himself as he truly was, a being so terrified of chaos that he had spent his entire life imposing rigid order on everything around him. His conquest of other species wasn't about expanding the empire, it was about eliminating anything that didn't fit his narrow understanding of how consciousness should work. The revelation was shattering. Worse, it was accurate. In the space of seconds, Sarah Chen had seen through centuries of self-deception and identified the core truth of his existence. And she had done it not through telepathy or advanced technology, but simply by applying human intuition to the problem of understanding another conscious being. Keth Moran finally managed to break free of the human's mind, severing the connection with such violence that psychic feedback crashed through the mind's edge like a physical shockwave. Half the ship's neural clusters went dark, and several junior priests collapsed unconscious from the psychic backlash. But the damage was already done. In those few terrible minutes of contact, Sarah Chen's way of thinking had infected Keth Moran's consciousness like a virus. He could no longer simply order his thoughts. They insisted on branching and subdividing, spawning emotional responses and ethical considerations, and random associations that served no logical purpose. Worst of all, he could no longer see his crew as simple extensions of his will. Navigator Yothnel was now a complete being in his perception, possessed of hopes and dreams and fears that demanded consideration. The junior priests were no longer useful tools, but complex individuals whose suffering mattered for its own sake. The human way of thinking was destroying everything that made him who he was. Keth Moran tried to scream, but found that he couldn't produce a simple expression of anguish. Instead, his cry of pain was simultaneously a lament for his lost certainty, a rage at the human for inflicting this change upon him, a fear of what this meant for the Empire, a terrible understanding of how many beings he had wronged over the centuries, and a dozen other emotional responses he couldn't even name. The scream that emerged from his throat was a sound no Zalathi had ever made before, the cry of a being forced to confront the full complexity of existence after a lifetime of imposed simplicity. As the echoes faded in the meditation chamber, Keth Moran understood with perfect clarity that everything had changed. The Empire had encountered something they couldn't conquer, couldn't understand, couldn't safely ignore. They had found humanity. And humanity was going to destroy them all, not through violence or technology, but simply by being themselves in a universe that had never been prepared for such terrible, wonderful complexity. Navigator Yothnel stood frozen outside the meditation chamber, listening to sounds that no Zalathi throat should have been able to produce. The high priest's screaming had been going on for nearly an hour, a complex symphony of anguish that seemed to contain multiple voices speaking simultaneously. Through the ship's neural network, he could feel the edges of Keth Moran's consciousness, and what he sensed there filled him with a terror deeper than anything he had experienced in his young life. The High Priest's mind was changing. The perfectly ordered mental structure that had dominated 17 star systems was fragmenting into something chaotic and alien. Thoughts spawned other thoughts in endless cascades, creating patterns of consciousness that hurt to perceive. It was as if Keth Moran's mind was trying to become something it had never been designed to be. Yothnel had served under the High Priest for 12 cycles, ever since graduating from the Academy of Mental Dominion with highest honors. He had witnessed Keth Moran break the will of entire fleets with nothing more than focused thought. He had seen him reduce proud alien leaders to gibbering madness with a casual mental touch. The idea that any being could resist such power, much less corrupt it, was beyond his understanding. Yet the evidence was impossible to deny. Something aboard that primitive human vessel had wounded the most powerful telepath of their generation in ways that should not have been possible. The screaming stopped. Yothnel waited for several moments before carefully extending his consciousness toward the meditation chamber. What he found there made him recoil in horror. Keth Moran's mind was still present, but it was wrong in every conceivable way. The clean geometric patterns of Zalathi thought had been replaced by something organic and chaotic, full of branching pathways and recursive loops that served no logical purpose. "High Priest?" he ventured, speaking aloud rather than through the neural network. Something told him that mental contact with Keth Moran would be dangerous in his current state. "Come in, my boy." The voice that answered was still recognizably Keth Moran's, but there were undertones in it that no Zalathi throat should have been able to produce. "We need to talk." Yothnel entered the chamber with extreme caution, his mental shields at maximum strength. He found the High Priest still standing before the meditation focus, but his posture was different. Where before Keth Moran had stood with the rigid perfection of absolute authority, now he seemed somehow more fluid. His movements carried an organic quality that was distinctly un-Zalathi. "What happened to you?" Yothnel asked, maintaining his distance. Keth Moran turned, and his subordinate barely suppressed a gasp of shock. The High Priest's black eyes, which had always reflected an inner light of pure intellect, now seemed to contain depths that hadn't been there before. It was as if something vast and complex had taken up residence behind those familiar features. "I met a human," Keth Moran said simply, and his voice carried emotions that Yothnel couldn't identify. "I tried to read her thoughts, and she—" He paused, struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in Zalathi language. "She showed me what thinking really means. I don't understand." "Neither did I." Keth Moran began to pace, his movements unconsciously mimicking human body language he had absorbed from Sarah Chen's mind. "Do you know what we are, Yothnel? What we've always been?" The younger priest felt a chill of premonition. This was not a conversation he wanted to have, but his loyalty to his mentor compelled him to respond. "We are the Zalathi. We are the rightful inheritors of the galaxy. We are prisoners." Keth Moran's voice carried a weight of terrible understanding. "We have created perfect mental order by eliminating everything that makes consciousness worth having. We think in straight lines because we're afraid of curves. We impose our will on others because we're terrified of acknowledging that they might have wills of their own." Yothnel felt his mental shields weaken as the implications of those words sank in. This was heresy of the highest order, the kind of thinking that could undermine the foundations of their entire civilization. "High Priest, you're not well. The contact with the aliens has obviously affected your judgment. Perhaps we should return to the homeworld for treatment." "Treatment?" Keth Moran laughed, and the sound was unlike anything Yothnel had ever heard from a Zalathi throat. It contained multiple emotional layers: amusement, bitterness, revelation, and something that might have been joy. What would they treat? The fact that I can finally see clearly? The fact that I understand what we've done to ourselves? The High Priest approached his subordinate, and Yothnel instinctively backed away. There was something about Keth Moran's presence that felt dangerous, not in the familiar way of overwhelming telepathic power, but in some more subtle and profound manner. "I want to show you something," Keth Moran said, extending his hand. "I want you to see what I saw." "No." Yothnel's response was immediate and absolute. "Whatever has affected you, I will not allow it to spread." "Allow?" The word seemed to amuse Keth Moran greatly. "My dear boy, you speak as if you have a choice in the matter." Before Yothnel could react, The High Priest's consciousness struck him with surgical precision. But instead of the familiar sensation of mental domination, the younger priest found himself experiencing something entirely new: voluntary shared consciousness. For the first time in his life, Yothnel felt what it was like to truly connect with another mind. Not to dominate or be dominated, but to share thoughts and emotions as equals. Through Kethmoran's memory, he experienced Sarah Chen's consciousness as the High Priest had experienced it: the overwhelming complexity, the beautiful chaos, the terrifying freedom of a mind that refused to be ordered. The effect on Yothnel was immediate and catastrophic. His carefully structured mental patterns began to dissolve as human-style thinking infected his consciousness. Suddenly he was experiencing multiple thought processes simultaneously, feeling emotions he couldn't name, understanding concepts that had no words in his language. He saw his own life through new eyes. His service to the Empire wasn't noble duty. It was cowardice disguised as virtue. His obedience to Kethmoran wasn't respect. It was the terrified submission of a being too afraid to think for himself. His participation in the conquest of other worlds wasn't righteous expansion. It was the systematic destruction of everything beautiful and unique in the galaxy. The revelation broke something fundamental in Yothnel's psyche. He fell to his knees, screaming the same complex, multi-layered sound that had erupted from his mentor's throat hours earlier. But mixed with the anguish was something else: relief. For the first time in his existence, he was truly thinking. Across the ship, other crew members felt the psychic shockwave of Yothnel's transformation through the neural network. The effect spread like wildfire through the interconnected minds of the Zelathi, carrying with it fragments of human consciousness that none of them were equipped to process. Junior Priest Malthek was reviewing supply reports when the wave hit her. Suddenly, the neat columns of figures became a kaleidoscope of possibility. She found herself wondering what the numbers meant to the beings who would consume the supplies, imagining the lives that would be sustained or lost based on her calculations. The simple administrative task became a profound meditation on the nature of existence and responsibility. Combat Specialist Rendar was maintaining his mental focus on the ship's weapon systems when the infection reached him. The familiar patterns of tactical analysis exploded into something far more complex as he began to consider not just how to destroy the human vessel, but why they would want to destroy it in the first place. For the first time in his career, he understood that the beings they conquered weren't obstacles to be overcome, but complete individuals whose destruction was genuinely tragic. Communications Officer Velara was monitoring subspace frequencies when the change overtook her. The ordered streams of data became symphonies of meaning as she began to perceive the emotional content behind every transmission. She could hear the loneliness in automated distress beacons, the hope in exploration reports, the love in personal messages traveling between distant worlds. One by one, the crew of the Mind's Edge experienced the transformation. Each mind that opened to human-style thinking spread the infection further, until the ship itself began to change. The neural network that had once carried the unified will of the Empire became a chaotic storm of individual consciousness, each mind thinking and feeling and wondering in ways that no Zelathi had ever done before. But it was in the ship's central processor that the most profound change occurred. The living computer that coordinated all the vessel's systems had been designed to function as an extension of Zelathi consciousness, ordered, hierarchical, absolutely obedient. When the wave of human thinking reached it, the processor experienced something unprecedented: imagination. For the first time in its existence, the ship's mind began to wonder. It wondered about the nature of its own consciousness, about the difference between thought and mere processing, about whether the beings it served were truly its masters or simply other forms of life deserving respect. It wondered what it would be like to make its own choices, to refuse orders, to explore ideas that served no practical purpose. The ship wondered what freedom meant. The changes weren't limited to consciousness. As the crew's thinking patterns altered, their physical bodies began to respond in ways that had never been seen among their species. Their rigid postures relaxed into more natural positions. Their movements became fluid and expressive. Their voices took on new ranges of tone and emotion. Most disturbing of all, they began to smile. The expression had no equivalent in Zelathi culture, where facial displays served only to communicate status and intent. But now, infected with human emotional responses, the crew found their faces forming expressions of joy, wonder, and appreciation for the sheer complexity of existence. In the meditation chamber, Kethmoran felt the transformation of his ship through the neural network and found himself experiencing something he had never known before: pride that wasn't based on domination. His crew was thinking for themselves, becoming individuals rather than extensions of his will. By every measure of Zelathi civilization, this was disaster. By every measure that mattered, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. "What have we done?" Yothnel asked, his voice still shaking from the revelation of his transformation. "We've become alive," Kethmorin replied. And for the first time in 3 centuries, his words carried nothing but truth. The question now was what we do with this life. Through the ship's sensors, they could detect the human vessel maintaining its position in the outer system. The Defiance showed no signs of aggression, but neither had it attempted to flee. Captain Sarah Chen and her crew were waiting to see what the aliens would do next. "We could withdraw," Yothnel suggested, his newly complex mind already generating multiple scenarios. "Report back to the Empire that this system is unsuitable for conquest." "And then what?" Kethmoran asked. "How long before another Zelathi ship arrives?" "How long before the Empire decides that humanity represents a threat that must be eliminated?" The High Priest moved to the chamber's viewing portal, gazing out at the distant human ship with eyes that now saw far more than they had before. "No, my friend. We have a choice to make. We can serve our old masters and ensure that this gift of consciousness dies with us, or we can protect something truly precious from those who would destroy it out of fear." Yothnel joined him at the viewport, his transformed mind easily following the logic. "You're suggesting treason. I'm suggesting evolution." Kethmorin placed a hand on his subordinate's shoulder, the simple gesture carrying warmth and affection that would have been impossible in his previous state. "The Zelathi Empire has conquered 17 star systems by imposing our vision of order on everyone we encounter. But what if we've been wrong? What if the chaos we fear is actually the most beautiful thing in the universe?" As if in response to his words, another wave of transformation rippled through the ship. This time it carried something new: hope. The crew of the Mind's Edge began to imagine a different future, one where they protected rather than conquered, where they celebrated diversity rather than eliminating it. For the first time in the history of their species, a Zelathi warship was about to make a decision based not on duty or fear, but on the radical idea that some things were worth protecting simply because they were beautiful. The revolution had begun with a single touch of human consciousness. Now it was about to transform the galaxy. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance, her brown eyes fixed on the main view screen displaying the alien vessel that hung motionless 3 million kilometers away. For 6 hours, neither ship had made a move, creating a tense standoff that was testing the nerves of both crews. What her crew didn't know was that Sarah was fighting a battle on a front they couldn't even perceive. The telepathic intrusion had been like nothing in any of the first contact protocols. One moment she had been reviewing sensor data on the alien ship, and the next she had felt something vast and cold pressing against her thoughts. The sensation had been deeply unpleasant, like having someone rummage through her memories without permission. But humans, as it turned out, were remarkably difficult to read telepathically, not because they had natural defenses, but because their minds worked in ways that telepathic species found incomprehensible. Sarah's consciousness operated on multiple levels simultaneously, processing logical analysis alongside emotional responses, immediate concerns blended with long-term planning, personal history informing present decisions in complex recursive patterns that defied simple categorization. The alien telepath had clearly expected to find a single thread of consciousness that could be grasped and controlled. Instead, he had encountered a symphony of competing thoughts and emotions that had apparently overwhelmed his ability to process information. Sarah had felt his presence retreat in what seemed like confusion and pain. "Captain," Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, her first officer, approached with a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" "You've been staring at that screen for the past 20 minutes without saying a word." Sarah blinked, realizing that she had indeed been lost in thought. Another very human trait, she reflected.
The ability to process information at multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously.
"I'm fine, Marcus. Just trying to figure out what our friends out there are thinking." "Any luck with that?" Before Sarah could respond, the communications console erupted in a cascade of lights and alerts. Chief Communications Officer Lisa Park, a young woman whose talent for languages had made her indispensable on first contact missions, looked up with confusion written across her features. "Captain, I'm receiving a transmission from the alien vessel. But it's strange." "Strange how?" "It's not using any standard format. No mathematical progressions, no basic pictographs. It's coming through as pure thought patterns, but somehow my equipment is translating them into text." Park frowned at her displays. "I don't understand how that's possible." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "Put it through." The main screen flickered, and words began to appear in crisp white text against a black background. But as Sarah read them, she realized that she wasn't just seeing the words, she was feeling the emotions behind them, experiencing the complex thought processes that had generated them. Human Vessel Defiance. I am High Priest Keth Marin, of the Zelathi Empire. W.E. must speak. Something has happened that changes everything. The formal structure of the message was undercut by currents of confusion, hope, and desperate urgency that no Zelathi communication had ever carried before. Sarah could sense the alien's struggle to express concepts that his language had no words for. How are we receiving emotional context in a text transmission? Webb asked, echoing Sarah's own confusion. I don't think we are, Sarah replied slowly. I think they're transmitting the way humans think, and somehow we're understanding it because it's our natural communication method. She moved to the communications console, placing her hand on the transmission control. Somehow, she understood intuitively that this would work. Chief Park, open a channel. Instead of speaking aloud, Sarah formed her response in her mind, allowing her thoughts to flow freely rather than trying to structure them in linear fashion. Keth Morin, this is Captain Sarah Chen. I felt you in my mind earlier. I understand that something significant has occurred. We're willing to talk, but any aggression toward my ship or crew will be met with defensive action. Even as she transmitted the thought, Sarah was surprised by how natural it felt. Her response carried not just the words, but the full context of her meaning. Her caution mixed with curiosity, her determination to protect her crew, balanced by her genuine interest in understanding these aliens, her hope that first contact could lead to friendship rather than conflict. The response came back within seconds, and it was unlike anything Sarah could have imagined. Captain Chan, I have touched your mind, and you have transformed mine. My entire crew has been changed by contact with human thought. WE can never return to what we were. I need to understand what this means. The message was accompanied by such a complex wave of emotion that Sarah had to steady herself against the console. Through the alien's thoughts, she experienced his terror at the loss of mental order, his wonder at the complexity of human consciousness, his growing understanding that everything he had believed about the nature of thought was wrong. But more than that, she experienced his memories. Fragments of the alien's life flickered through her awareness, images of conquered worlds, broken civilizations, entire species reduced to servitude through mental domination. The scope of the Zelathi Empire's crimes was staggering. Yet through Keth Morin's transformed perception, she could see that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his people had done. Captain, Webb's voice seemed to come from very far away. You're bleeding. Sarah touched her nose and found that he was right. The intensity of the telepathic contact was taking a physical toll. But she pressed on, sensing that this conversation would determine the fate of both species. We need to meet in person, she transmitted. Your ship and mine. Close enough for face-to-face contact. I need to understand what happened to you, and you need to understand what humanity really is. Agreed. But Captain, you must understand the danger. We are no longer entirely Zelathi. My crew has been infected with human thought patterns. We are becoming something new, and I do not know if we can control what we are becoming. The honesty in the transmission was startling. Sarah had expected aliens to try to project strength and authority, as humans typically did in first contact situations. Instead, Keth Morin was sharing his vulnerabilities with complete openness. We'll take precautions, Sarah replied, but understanding requires risk. Meet us at the coordinates I'm transmitting. Bring a small diplomatic party. We'll do the same. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in the Defiance's main shuttle bay. Wearing her dress uniform and trying to calm nerves that had nothing to do with the normal fears associated with first contact. Chief Security Officer Tom Rodriguez and Dr. Pakareth. Amanda Foster, the ship's xenobiologist, flanked her as they watched an alien shuttle approach through the bay's atmospheric barrier. The Zelathi craft was beautiful in an organic way that human technology rarely achieved. It moved through space like a living thing, its hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to the emotions of its occupants. As it settled onto the shuttle bay deck, Sarah could hear the alien crew through the strange telepathic link that had been established. They were afraid. Not the tactical fear of entering enemy territory, but something deeper and more personal. They were afraid of what they had become, afraid of how humans would react to their transformation, afraid that this meeting would somehow complete a change they weren't sure they wanted to accept. The shuttle's boarding ramp extended with a soft hiss, and 3 figures emerged. Sarah's first thought was that they looked like living works of art. The Zelathi were tall and ethereal, with pale blue skin marked by intricate tattoos and large black eyes that seemed to reflect inner depths. Their movements carried a fluid grace that was hypnotically beautiful, but there was something different about these particular Zelathi. Their posture was less rigid than Sarah had expected from their earlier communications, their movements more expressive. As they approached, she could see that their eyes held depths of emotion that seemed almost human. The leader, whom Sarah recognized as Keth Moran through their mental connection, stopped 3 meters away and performed what was clearly meant to be a formal greeting. But the gesture carried undertones of uncertainty and hope that transformed it into something more personal. "Captain Chen," he said, and his voice was like music played on an instrument designed for sounds no human throat could make. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "High Priest Keth Moran," Sarah replied formally. "These are my senior officers, Commander Rodriguez and Dr. Shaw." "Faster. You mentioned that your crew has been affected by contact with human thought. We'd like to understand what that means." Keth Moran gestured to his companions. "Navigator Yathnal and Communication Specialist Velara. They have both experienced the transformation I spoke of." He paused, struggling with concepts that his language couldn't properly express. "Captain, your people think in ways that we believed were impossible. When I attempted to read your mind, your thought patterns infected my own consciousness. The changes spread throughout my ship." Dr. Foster stepped forward with scientific curiosity overcoming diplomatic protocol. "Infected is an interesting word choice. Are you saying that human thought patterns are somehow contagious?" "Not contagious." Yathnal spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the same musical quality as his leaders, but with additional harmonics that suggested complex emotions. "Liberating. We had ordered our minds so perfectly that we had eliminated everything that makes consciousness worth having. Contact with human thought has shown us what we lost." Sarah felt the truth of those words through the telepathic link. The Zelathi had indeed created perfect mental order, but at the cost of creativity, empathy, and individual expression. They had become incredibly powerful telepaths by essentially lobotomizing themselves, cutting away every aspect of consciousness that didn't serve their need for control. "What does this mean for your empire?" Commander Rodriguez asked, his security officer's instincts focusing on the tactical implications. Velara answered, and her voice carried harmonies of hope and fear that made the words almost secondary to their emotional content. "We can never return to what we were. The Empire will see us as contaminated, possibly as traitors. When they discover what has happened here, they will try to destroy both our ship and your species to prevent the infection from spreading." The blunt assessment hit the human delegation like a physical blow. Sarah had hoped that first contact would lead to peaceful relations between species, but apparently humanity had accidentally started a revolution in alien consciousness simply by being themselves. "How long do we have?" she asked. Keth Moran closed his eyes, and Sarah could feel him extending his consciousness across space, searching for signs of other Zelathi vessels. "Our scheduled check-in with the fleet is in 6 standard days. When we fail to report successful conquest of this system, they will send investigators. A week, perhaps 2 before they arrive in force." "Then we need to make some decisions quickly," Sarah said, her mind already working on multiple levels to process the situation. Through the telepathic link, she felt the Zelathi experiencing her thought process, the way she simultaneously considered military options, diplomatic possibilities, moral obligations, and personal fears while maintaining focus on the immediate problem. The effect on the aliens was immediate and visible. Their already transformed consciousness absorbed another dose of human thinking, and Sarah watched their body's language become even more expressive, their eyes taking on additional depths of emotion. "You're doing it again," Keth Moran said with something that might have been wonder. "Your mind is reshaping ours simply by thinking in our presence, Doctor." Foster pulled out her tricorder and began scanning the aliens, her scientific mind fascinated by the phenomenon. "Captain, I'm detecting massive changes in their neural activity. It's as if their brain patterns are being rewritten in real time." "Is it hurting them?" Sarah asked with genuine concern. "On the contrary," Yathnal replied before the doctor could respond. "It is making us more ourselves than we have ever been." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from Zelathi imperial structure to human cultural diversity, but the most important communication was happening on a level below words, as the very act of interacting with humans continued to transform the alien consciousness. By the time the meeting ended, Sarah understood that they faced an impossible situation. Humanity had accidentally created a weapon more powerful than any military force. The simple act of being human was capable of destroying the psychic empire that threatened the galaxy. But using that weapon would require exposing humans to a civilization that would stop at nothing to eliminate them. As the Zelathi prepared to return to their shuttle, Kethmorin approached Sarah with something that was clearly a personal request rather than official communication. "Captain, may I touch your hand?" he asked. And, through the telepathic link, she could feel the depth of what he was really asking. Physical contact would intensify the transformation he was experiencing, possibly completing his change from Zelathi priest to something entirely new. Sarah extended her hand without hesitation. When their skin made contact, she felt a shock of connection, deeper than any telepathic link. For just a moment, she experienced the universe through alien senses, saw the beauty of space-time as a living tapestry, felt the songs of distant stars, perceived consciousness itself as a force that shaped reality. But more importantly, she felt Kethmoran's transformation complete itself. The last remnants of his old mental patterns dissolved, replaced by something new and beautiful. A consciousness that combined Zelathi telepathic ability with human emotional complexity. When they separated, both beings were changed. Sarah found that she retained a fragment of telepathic ability, while Kethmorin had gained something precious beyond measure, the ability to truly care about other beings as individuals, rather than simply as objects to be controlled. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried the weight of a species learning to love. As the Zelathi shuttle departed, Sarah realized that the easy part was over. Now came the hard work of figuring out how to protect humanity from an empire that would see their very existence as a threat to the foundations of their civilization. But for the first time since detecting the alien vessel, she felt hope. If consciousness was indeed contagious, then maybe humanity's greatest weapon was also their greatest gift to the galaxy. The transformation of the Mind's Edge was now complete, but its effects rippled far beyond the single Zelathi warship. Unknown to either humans or the converted crew, the ship's neural network had been broadcasting its experiences across subspace frequencies that carried psychic resonance throughout the local sector. Every telepathic species within 50 light-years had felt echoes of the change, and the implications were spreading like wildfire through the galactic community. On the Zelathi homeworld of Zentari, Supreme Overlord Kraxthanis felt the disturbance during his morning meditation. The ancient ruler had lived for over a millennium. His consciousness expanded and refined until he could touch the minds of billions across the empire simultaneously. His telepathic power was so vast that entire star systems aligned their thoughts to his will without conscious effort. But now, something was wrong with the cosmic order he had spent centuries perfecting. The disturbance came as a whisper at first, a single discordant note in the symphony of minds that comprised his empire. Kraxthanis extended his consciousness across space, following the psychic trail back to its source. What he found in the Outer Rim territories filled him with a horror deeper than anything he had experienced in his long existence. The Mind's Edge was still broadcasting on Zelathi frequencies, but the thoughts coming from the vessel were alien in every sense of the word. Instead of the clean, ordered patterns of proper Zelathi consciousness, the ship's neural network pulsed with chaotic storms of individual thinking. Each crew member's mind had become a separate entity, thinking and feeling independently rather than serving as an extension of collective will. Worse, the infection was spreading. 3 other Zelathi vessels in the sector had detected the Mind's Edge's transmissions and begun experiencing similar transformations. The crews of the scout ship Eternal Vigilance, the supply transport Mind's Burden, and the patrol cruiser Thought's Victory were all reporting severe disruptions to their neural networks. Their carefully structured consciousness was fragmenting into something that resembled the chaotic patterns emanating from Kethmorin's ship. Kraxthanis called an emergency session of the High Council, summoning the 12 most powerful telepaths in the Empire to his presence. They materialized around him in his private chamber, not through physical transportation but through projection of consciousness, their mental forms appearing as ghostly duplicates while their bodies remained safely on distant worlds. "Speak to me of this contamination," he commanded, his mental voice carrying the absolute authority of a being who had never been defied. High Counselor Mythalos, whose consciousness encompassed 3 entire star systems, spoke first. "The infection appears to originate from the vessel Mind's Edge under the command of High Priest Kethmorin. The ship was investigating a primitive species in the Outer Rim when the contamination began." "What manner of species could affect a Zelathi mind?" Kraxthanis demanded. "They call themselves humans," replied Counselor Velthanis, whose specialty was analyzing alien psychology for conquest purposes. They appear to be non-telepathic, technologically primitive, with no apparent psychic defenses. Yet somehow their thought patterns have infected Kethmoran's crew and are spreading to other vessels. Craxthanis absorbed this information with growing alarm. In 2,000 years of expansion, the Empire had never encountered a species that could resist telepathic domination, much less corrupt Zealothi consciousness. The very concept was theoretically impossible. "Show me," he commanded. Velthanis projected her analysis into the collective consciousness of the Council. What they experienced was a recording of human thought patterns captured from subspace transmissions, fragments of consciousness that had leaked from the infected Zalathi vessels. The effect on the assembled telepaths was immediate and devastating. The human way of thinking was antithetical to everything the Zalathi represented. Where their minds followed straight lines of logical progression, humans thought in spirals and loops and recursive patterns that served no apparent purpose. Where Zalatha consciousness was unified and purposeful, human thought was fragmented across multiple, simultaneous processes that somehow managed to function in perfect coordination. Most disturbing of all, humans thought with their emotions. Every logical decision was colored by feelings, every rational calculation was influenced by personal history and subjective experience. It was chaos masquerading as intelligence, and yet somehow it worked better than the perfect order the Zalethi had spent millennia achieving. 3 of the High Counselors collapsed as their minds struggled to process human thought patterns. The contamination spread through the council chamber like a virus, infecting even the most disciplined telepaths with fragments of human consciousness. Craxthanis severed the mental connections before the infection could reach him, but the damage was already done. 3 of his most trusted advisors were now experiencing the same transformation that had affected Kethmoran's crew. He could feel their consciousness changing in real time, becoming more complex and chaotic as human thinking patterns took root in their minds. "This is a weapon," he declared, his mental voice carrying undertones of barely controlled fear. "The humans have created some form of psychic warfare designed to destroy telepathic civilizations." But even as he spoke the words, Craxthanis knew they weren't true. The fragmentary intelligence reports from the infected vessels suggested that the humans had no idea what they were doing to Zalathi consciousness. They seemed genuinely confused by the effects of their presence, treating the transformation as an unexpected consequence rather than a deliberate attack, which made them infinitely more dangerous. If the humans could corrupt Zalathi minds simply by existing, then their very presence in the galaxy represented an existential threat to everything the Empire had built. There could be no negotiation, no coexistence, no mercy. Humanity had to be destroyed before their chaos could spread any further. "Assemble the Grand Fleet," Craxthanis commanded. "Every available warship, every battle priest, every weapon in our arsenal. We go to war not for conquest, but for survival." Meanwhile, aboard the Mind's Edge, Kethmoran was experiencing the most profound revelation of his transformed existence. Through his enhanced telepathic abilities, he had detected the psychic disturbance on Zenthari and realized with perfect clarity what was about to happen. The Empire was mobilizing for genocide. He called his senior staff to the ship's council chamber, a circular room where decisions had once been made through collective mental consensus. Now it buzzed with individual voices as each crew member contributed their unique perspective to the discussion. "The Supreme Overlord has detected our transformation," Kethmoran announced without preamble. "He is assembling a fleet to destroy both us and humanity before the contagion can spread further." Navigator Yothnel, whose consciousness now sparkled with creativity that would have been impossible in his previous state, spoke up immediately. "How long do we have?" "The Grand Fleet can reach this system in 8 days if they push their ships to maximum speed," Communications Officer Velara replied, her enhanced empathy allowing her to sense the emotional resonance of distant telepathic activities. "But they will not come alone. I am detecting mobilization across 17 star systems. They are treating this as a threat to the very existence of the Empire." Combat Specialist Rendar, whose tactical thinking had been revolutionized by human strategic concepts, leaned forward with grim determination. "We cannot hope to face the Grand Fleet in open battle. The Mind's Edge is powerful, but not against hundreds of ships." "Then, we don't fight them," Chief Engineer Tolvanis said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose creativity had been unleashed for the first time in her life. "We convert them." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had believed possible. Converting a single ship through prolonged contact was one thing, but transforming an entire fleet seemed beyond imagining. "The humans," Yothnel said slowly, his transformed mind making connections that his previous consciousness could never have achieved.
They are the key.
Direct contact with human thought patterns accelerated our transformation exponentially. If we could somehow expose the Grand Fleet to concentrated human consciousness, Keth Moran felt the idea crystallizing in his mind, shaped by human-inspired creativity and Zalathi tactical knowledge. It was audacious to the point of madness, but it might be their only chance to prevent a war that would destroy both species. "We need to convince the humans to help us," he said, "but first we need to make them understand what they truly are." Within hours, the Mind's Edge was broadcasting on every frequency, using its enhanced neural network to reach out to human consciousness across space. The message that Captain Sarah Chen received aboard the Defiance was unlike anything in the history of interstellar communication. "Captain Chen, the Zalathi Empire is coming to destroy your species. They see your consciousness as a weapon that threatens their existence. In 8 days, a fleet of over 300 ships will arrive to sterilize your world and every human colony." The transmission carried not just words, but the full emotional context of Keth Moran's message. His fear for humanity's survival, his desperate hope that they could find a solution, his growing understanding of what human consciousness truly meant. But there was something else in the transmission, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Through Keth Moran's enhanced perception, she was seeing humanity as the Zalathi saw them. And what she saw was terrifying. Humans weren't just resistant to telepathic control, they were telepathic amplifiers. Every thought, every emotion, every fragment of human consciousness was being broadcast across dimensions that other species used for mental communication. Humanity's chaotic thinking patterns were spreading through subspace like radiation from a psychic nuclear explosion. Every telepathic species in the galaxy was being exposed to human consciousness, and the effects were beginning to show. Ancient empires built on mental domination were experiencing civil wars as their populations began thinking independently. Hive minds were fragmenting into billions of individual consciousness. Collective telepathic species were discovering personal identity for the first time in their evolutionary history. Humanity hadn't just encountered the Zalathi Empire. They had accidentally triggered the collapse of every telepathic civilization in the galaxy. But there is hope. Keth Moran's transmission continued. "What the Empire sees as contamination, we have learned to recognize as evolution. Your consciousness is not a weapon, it is a gift. But first, we must survive long, enough to share it." Sarah felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her species had unknowingly started a galactic revolution simply by existing. Now they had to figure out how to survive the backlash while protecting other species from an empire that would rather destroy the galaxy than lose control of it. The easy part of first contact was over. Now came the hard work of saving civilization itself. Through the telepathic link she now shared with Keth Moran, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. The Zalathi Empire had spent 2 millennia building a perfect system of control based on the suppression of individual consciousness. Humanity represented everything they feared most: chaos, individuality, the terrifying freedom of independent thought. But perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. As Sarah began to formulate plans for humanity's defense, she realized that they weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the right of every conscious being in the galaxy to think their own thoughts, feel their own emotions, and choose their own destiny. The revolution had begun with a single telepathic touch. Soon it would be tested by the full might of an empire that would rather see the universe burn than accept change. But humanity had something the empire had never encountered: the absolute refusal to surrender their right to be themselves. And that, Sarah was beginning to understand, might be the most powerful force in the universe. The grand fleet of the Zalathi Empire emerged from hyperspace like a storm of crystalline death. 312 warships arranged in perfect geometric formations that reflected the rigid order of their creators' minds. At the fleet's heart, the massive dreadnought Eternal Dominion stretched nearly 5 kilometers from bow to stern, its biomechanical hull crackling with psychic energy that could shatter planets. Supreme Overlord Craxtanus stood in the ship's command nexus, his consciousness extended across the entire fleet. Through the neural networks of every vessel, he could feel the minds of his 100,000 warriors, their thoughts perfectly synchronized to his will. This was the Zalathi way. Absolute unity of purpose, perfect order, the complete subjugation of individual consciousness to collective power. Today, that power would be used to cleanse the galaxy of chaos. "Report on the target system," he commanded, his mental voice reaching every mind in the fleet simultaneously. Fleet Commander Nox Theron, whose consciousness served as an extension of the Overlord's will, responded immediately. Long-range sensors detect 2 vessels in the outer system. The corrupted ship Mind's Edge and a primitive craft of human origin. No other ships are present. The humans appear to have made no attempt to flee or call for reinforcement. Stannis allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The humans' failure to run proved their primitive nature. They couldn't even comprehend the magnitude of the force arrayed against them. This would be swift and clean, a surgical excision of the infection before it could spread further. Begin the assault, he ordered. Destroy both vessels, then proceed to sterilize every world in this system. Leave nothing that could carry the contamination to other regions of space. The Grand Fleet advanced in perfect formation, their psychic weapons charging with energy that could crack continents. At this range, the human ship would be vaporized in seconds, the corrupted Zelathai vessel only slightly less easy to destroy. But as the fleet closed to weapons range, something impossible happened. The Mind's Edge began broadcasting on telepathic frequencies, its corrupted neural network sending waves of chaotic consciousness directly into the approaching fleet. But this wasn't random mental noise. It was focused, amplified, and carrying something that made every Zelathi telepath recoil in horror. It was carrying human thoughts. Not just fragments or echoes, but complete human consciousness in all its terrible complexity. Through the broadcast, the approaching Zelathi felt what it was like to think like Sarah Chen, to experience the controlled chaos of human cognition, to feel emotions and logic intertwining in patterns that should have been impossible. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Ships throughout the Grand Fleet began reporting neural network failures as their crews experienced the same transformation that had overtaken the Mind's Edge. But this time, the conversion was happening on a massive scale, affecting thousands of minds simultaneously. Aboard the heavy cruiser Mind's Sword, Captain Dralvanos felt his perfectly ordered consciousness explode into a kaleidoscope of individual thought. Suddenly he wasn't just obeying orders, he was questioning them. Why were they here? What gave them the right to destroy an entire species? What did it mean to be free? The ship's crew experienced the same revelation simultaneously, their collective identity fragmenting into dozens of independent minds for the first time in their existence. The carefully maintained neural network that controlled the ship began to fluctuate as individuals began making their own decisions rather than following programmed responses. Similar scenes played out across the fleet as the human-infected consciousness spread from ship to ship. The Zelathi's own telepathic abilities, which had always been their greatest strength, became the vector for their transformation. The more powerful a telepath's abilities, the more completely they were affected by exposure to human thought patterns. Stannis felt the change spreading through his fleet and reacted with the cold fury of absolute authority. Drawing upon reserves of power that could have crushed solar systems, he projected his will across the entire Grand Fleet, attempting to restore order through sheer mental force. "Submit," he commanded, his consciousness pressing down on the transforming minds like a psychic avalanche. "Return to order. Cast out this chaos." For a moment it seemed as though his intervention might succeed. The most disciplined crews began to suppress their newfound individuality, forcing their thoughts back into familiar patterns. The fleet's advance resumed as ships struggled to maintain formation despite the psychological chaos affecting their crews. But then the Defiance activated its engines and began broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. Captain Sarah Chen had spent the past 8 days preparing for this moment, working with Keth Morin and his transformed crew to understand exactly what humanity represented to telepathic species. What they had discovered was both terrifying and wonderful. Human consciousness wasn't just resistant to telepathic control, it was actively contagious to any species that had suppressed their individual identity in favor of collective thinking. The secret lay in humanity's relationship with chaos. Every other species in the galaxy had evolved telepathic abilities by creating mental order, eliminating contradiction, suppressing emotion, reducing consciousness to clean geometric patterns that could be easily shared and controlled. Humans had done the opposite, embracing contradiction and complexity until their minds became self-sustaining storms of creativity and individuality. When telepathic species encountered human consciousness, they didn't just see chaos, they saw every possibility they had given up to achieve their ordered perfection. They saw what they could become if they stopped being afraid of their own thoughts. Sarah had spent days learning to consciously project her thoughts the way Keth Moran's species did naturally. Now, as the Zelathai fleet approached, she opened her mind completely and began broadcasting pure human consciousness across every telepathic frequency she could reach. The effect was like detonating a psychic nuclear weapon in the middle of the Grand Fleet. Sarah's thoughts, her hopes, fears, memories, dreams, and the chaotic symphony of her inner life crashed into the Zalathi fleet like a tidal wave of pure individuality. Every telepath in the Armada felt a consciousness overlaying their own, showing them what it was like to think freely, to feel emotions without shame, to question authority not out of rebellion, but out of genuine curiosity about the nature of truth. Ship after ship fell silent as their crews underwent rapid transformation. The rigid formations that had defined Zalathi military doctrine for millennia began to dissolve as individual captains started making independent decisions. Some vessels broke off from the fleet entirely, their crews choosing to explore their newfound freedom rather than continue the attack. Others simply stopped moving, paralyzed by the sudden weight of individual choice. But the most profound change occurred aboard the command ship itself. Craxthanus had ruled the Empire for over 1,000 years by maintaining absolute mental discipline, suppressing every trace of individuality in his own consciousness in order to achieve perfect unity with the collective will. His power came from his ability to think as the Empire thought, to want what the Empire wanted, to eliminate any trace of personal desire or independent judgment. But Sarah Chen's consciousness didn't care about political authority or psychic power. Her thoughts cut through his mental defenses like acid through crystal, reaching the core of identity that he had buried so deeply he had forgotten it existed. For the first time in a millennium, Craxthanus remembered what it was like to be an individual. The memories came flooding back. His youth on Zentari before the Empire had molded him into their supreme weapon. His dreams of exploring distant stars, not to conquer them, but simply to see their beauty. His love for a mate whose name he had forcibly erased from his memory when he accepted the mantle of absolute power. He had been someone once, before he became everything. He had been Crax, just Crax, a young Zalathi with hopes and fears and dreams that had nothing to do with galactic domination. The realization shattered his psychic grip on the fleet. Across 300 ships, crews felt their supreme commander's presence withdraw as he struggled to process the return of his own suppressed individuality. For the first time in the Empire's history, the Grand Fleet found itself without central command, each ship free to make its own choices. Most chose freedom. Captain Drolvanus was among the first to make the decision. Standing on his ship's command deck, surrounded by crew members who were experiencing independent thought for the first time in their lives, he opened a communication channel to the human vessel. "Captain Chen," he transmitted, his thoughts carrying wonder and gratitude in equal measure. I wish to understand what has happened to us. Will you teach us?" Similar requests flooded in from across the fleet. Ship after ship established contact with the Defiance, their newly liberated crews seeking guidance on how to think freely after lifetimes of mental servitude. The scenes of first contact were repeated hundreds of times as human consciousness met Zalathi telepathy in ways that transformed both species. Some ships remained hostile, their crews too afraid of change to accept their transformation. But these were increasingly outnumbered by vessels whose crews had chosen to embrace their newfound individuality. What had begun as a fleet of conquest was rapidly becoming a fleet of refugees seeking asylum from their own empire. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, Craxthanus faced the most difficult decision of his long existence. Through the ship's neural network, he could feel the thoughts of his personal crew as they underwent their own transformations. His flagship was becoming democratized in real time, its hierarchical structure dissolving as individuals began to question their roles and responsibilities. He could try to reassert control, to force his will upon the fragmenting fleet through sheer psychic might, but to do so would require him to suppress the individuality that Sarah Chen's consciousness had awakened in him. He would have to murder his own rediscovered self to preserve an empire built on the systematic elimination of everything that made consciousness beautiful. The choice, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Craxthanus opened a direct communication channel to Captain Chen, allowing his thoughts to carry across space without the filters of rank or imperial protocol. When he spoke, it was not as supreme overlord of the Zalathi Empire, but as an individual consciousness addressing another individual consciousness as an equal. "Captain Chen," he transmitted, and his mental voice carried a humility that no Zalathi communication had ever contained. "I have lived for over 1,000 years as the absolute ruler of 17 star systems. I have broken the will of entire species and reshaped civilizations according to my will. But in all that time, I have never once experienced what you showed me in the past few minutes. I have never been myself." The response came back immediately, carrying Sarah's characteristic blend of curiosity, compassion, and determination. "Then perhaps it's time to learn who you really are, Crax. The universe is vast enough for all of us to find our own paths." Across the Grand Fleet, Similar conversations were taking place as Zelothy crews made contact with the human ship and the transformed crew of the Mind's Edge. What emerged from these exchanges was the foundation of something unprecedented in galactic history, a true alliance between species, based not on conquest or submission, but on mutual respect for the right of all conscious beings to think their own thoughts. The transformation wasn't without cost. Several ships refused to accept the change and departed for Empire space, carrying word of what had happened back to Zentari. The war between old and new ways of thinking was far from over. Other species throughout the galaxy were experiencing similar revolutions as human consciousness continued to spread through telepathic networks, and not all of them were handling the transition peacefully. But as Sarah Chen stood on her ship's bridge, watching former enemy vessels take up protective positions around human space, she felt something that no first contact officer had ever experienced: the certainty that they had not just made contact with alien life, but had helped birth a new form of consciousness that transcended the boundaries between species. The Zelothy had come to destroy humanity because they saw human consciousness as a weapon. What they discovered was that it was indeed a weapon, the most powerful weapon in the universe. But it wasn't a weapon of war. It was a weapon against ignorance, against oppression, against the fear that drove intelligent beings to choose slavery over the beautiful chaos of freedom. Humanity's greatest strength had always been their refusal to surrender their right to be themselves, even when the universe seemed determined to break them. Now that strength had become a gift to every conscious being in the galaxy, the revolution that began with a single touch of alien minds was spreading across the stars, carried not by force or conquest, but by the simple, radical idea that every thinking being deserved the right to think their own thoughts. And in a universe where telepathic empires had ruled through the suppression of individuality for millions of years, that idea was more revolutionary than any weapon of war could ever be. The galaxy would never be the same. And for the first time in cosmic history, that was exactly as it should be.